The council chamber had been built to make visitors feel small, and for 11,000 years it had succeeded without a single exception. It was a hollow sphere of pale stone suspended above a well of light, and the seats of the 12 ringed its equator like the teeth of some vast, patient mouth. Petitioners stood on a disk at the center, a single figure adrift in a room designed to remind them that they were nothing more than a mote of dust that had briefly been noticed. Species had wept there. Empires had surrendered there. Kings had knelt on that disk and offered their crowns, and the council had accepted them the way a river accepts a stone, without pause, without gratitude, without so much as a ripple to mark the change. Councillor Selvarin had sat in the highest seat for 300 years, and in all that time she had never once seen the room fail to do its work. She had watched the proud shrink. She had watched the defiant learn silence. She trusted the chamber the way a soldier trusts a wall, and so when the human delegation was announced, she settled her long body into the curve of her seat and prepared to feel the old, comfortable certainty of another lesser thing being made to understand its place. The human who stepped onto the disk was young. That was the first thing Selvarin noted, and the first thing that troubled her, though she could not yet say why. The others of her kind measured authority in years, in the slow accretion of scars and titles and the deaths of rivals, and by that measure this creature should not have been permitted to speak at all. She was perhaps 25 of her world's revolutions, slight, unarmored, her dark hair pulled back from a face that had not yet learned to hide what it felt. Her name, the record said, was Ada Reyes, and she carried no weapon, no delegation of elders to shield her, no gift of tribute. She carried a single data slate, and a way of looking around the chamber that Selvarin had never seen before. She looked up. That was all, but no one looked up in this room. The architecture forbade it. The light above the disk was tuned to a frequency that made the eyes water and the head bow, a subtle cruelty engineered into the stone so long ago that most of the 12 had forgotten it was there. Petitioners kept their gazes low without ever knowing why, and in their bowed heads the council read submission and was satisfied. But the human girl tilted her chin back and studied the ring of seats above her, one by one, unhurried, as if she were a visitor in a gallery deciding which of the old portraits she found most interesting. She squinted against the light. She did not look away. "She has not been briefed," murmured Councillor Toth from the seat to Selvarin's left, his voter rendering the words into a wet clicking. "Or she is a fool." "Perhaps," Selvarin said, but she watched the human's eyes travel the room, and she did not think fool was the correct word. There was nothing vacant in that gaze. It was cataloging. It moved from seat to seat and it measured, and when it reached Selvarin's own high chair it stopped and held, and something behind the young face seemed to arrive at a small private conclusion before moving on. Selvarin felt, absurdly, that she had been read. That in the space of a breath, this unarmed child had learned something about her that 3 centuries of colleagues had not. She dismissed the feeling. It was the room's own strangeness reflected back, nothing more. "Human delegate," the chamber intoned, its voice pouring down from everywhere at once, a chord of the 12's languages layered into something no single throat could produce. "You come before the conquered of 12 to answer for the conduct of your species. You will speak when addressed and be silent otherwise. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings?" Every petitioner said yes. The word was practically part of the ritual. It was the first surrender, small and total, the sound of a thing agreeing to be judged. Selvarin had heard it 11,000 times in the histories and 300 years in her own ears, and she mouthed it now without thinking, the way one mouths the final line of a song heard since birth. The human did not say yes. "I understand what you intend by them," Ada Reyes said. Her voice was clear and it carried, thin and human and utterly without fear. "I'm not sure that's the same thing." A stillness moved through the ring of seats. It was not shock, exactly. The 12 were far too old and too armored for shock. It was something rarer and more dangerous, the pause of 12 ancient minds all turning at once toward the same small anomaly, the way a field of grazing animals will lift their heads in unison at a sound none of them can name. "You will find," said Counselor Toth, leaning forward so that the light caught the ridges of his skull, "that the distinction you are drawing is one this chamber does not recognize. You are here to be judged, delegate. Whether you understand it changes nothing about what will be done to you or your worlds." "I know," the human said, and then gently, as if she were correcting a child and did not wish to embarrass him, "That's what I came to talk about." Selvarin's translator rendered the words plainly, and yet she found herself replaying them, turning them, because there was a shape underneath them she could not fit into any of her categories. Petitioners bargained. Petitioners begged. Petitioners threatened, sometimes in the brief hot foolishness before they understood their position, and the council let them exhaust the threat and then showed them how small it had been. But this was none of those. This was a young creature standing in the most oppressive room ever built by intelligent hands, being told that her fate was already decided, and answering as though she had come not to receive a sentence but to offer an observation. The formal charge was read into the chamber, and it was long, because the council was thorough, and because length was itself a kind of pressure. Humanity was accused of destabilization, the particulars unspooled. 3 client species of the conquered had, within the span of a single generation of human contact, petitioned for the revision of their tribute obligations. 2 had requested the right to elect their own governors rather than accept the ones the council appointed. 1, the Illith, a docile aquatic people who had paid their grain levy without complaint for 4,000 years, had simply stopped. Not rebelled, not attacked, stopped. Their harvest ships had failed to arrive, and when the Concord's auditors went to ask why, the Illith had answered that they had considered the matter and decided the arrangement no longer suited them. The auditors had found no human ships in Illith space, no human weapons, no human agents whispering in the councils of the deep. They had found only that, at some point in the years since a human trade vessel had spent a season anchored in the Illith shallows, the Illith had begun to speak a word they had never had before. In the old Illith tongue there had been no way to say "I would rather not." Now there was. "You gave them a word," Selvarin said. She had not meant to speak. It came out of her before the decision to say it, which was itself so unlike her that she felt a flicker of alarm. The human turned her upward gaze to the high seat. "We didn't give them anything," she said. "We talked to them, they were curious about how we ran things. We told them, they asked questions, we answered." A small motion of her shoulders, that peculiar human gesture that meant nothing and everything. "They drew their own conclusions. That's the part I don't think this room knows how to charge me with." "The charge," rumbled Counselor Vane, whose seat governed the war fleets and who had said nothing until now, "is that your species is a contagion. You move among the ordered peoples of the conquered and you leave disorder behind you. Whether by design or by nature, the effect is the same, and the conquered does not require intent to act. A plague does not intend. We still burn the ships that carry it." It was a threat, and it was meant to land. Vane commanded more destructive force than any 3 of the client species possessed together. Behind his words lay the plain arithmetic of what the conquered could do to the human worlds if it chose, and every petitioner who had ever stood on that disk had felt the arithmetic settle over them like a cold weight and had bent beneath it. Ada Reyes considered him. She actually seemed to think about it, tilting her head, and Selvarin realized with a strange lurch that the girl was not weighing whether to be afraid. She was weighing whether the threat was true. "You could," the human said at last. "I believe that. You have the ships and you have the will, and if you decided to end us tomorrow, I don't think there's a fleet in human space that could stop you. I want to be honest about that because I think you expect me to pretend otherwise and then you'd win the argument by proving I lied." She set her data slate down on the disk, unopened. "So yes, you can burn us. But I'd like to ask the council a question first, if the chamber permits it, and I promise it's a real question and not a trick." "Ask," said Selvarin, before any of the others could refuse. The girl looked up at her again, and again Selvarin had the sensation of being seen with unusual precision, as if the young human had noticed something about her that she herself had spent 300 years not noticing. "If we're a plague," Ada Reyes said, "why did you invite us here to argue? You don't argue with a plague, you don't read it charges. You don't build a room to make it feel small and then wait to hear what it says." She let the question sit in the vast hollow air. "You burn it, quietly before it can talk. That's what you do to a real contagion, because a real contagion can't be reasoned with, and reasoning with it only gives it time. But you didn't do that. You brought me 11,000 light years to stand on this disk, and you're letting me speak. So somewhere in this room, somebody isn't sure I'm a plague. Somebody thinks I might be something you'd regret burning. I'd just like to know who." The chamber was silent. It was not the silence of the petitioner made small. Selvarin knew that silence. She had authored it 1,000 times, and this was not it. This was the silence of 12 ancient predators who had come to watch a small animal be afraid, and had instead heard the small animal ask a question. None of them wanted to answer in front of the others. She could feel it moving through the ring, the swift lateral glances, the sudden interest each counselor took in the neutral stone before them. Because the girl was right. That was the thing that made Selvarin's old hearts beat faster than they had in a century. The girl was right, and every one of the 12 knew it, and not one of them had realized it until an unarmed child said it aloud into the light. They had not burned humanity. They could have at first contact when the human worlds were fragile and few, and the fleets could have crossed their sky in a single season. It would have been simple. It was what the conquered did to things that frightened it, and the record was long and unbroken. And yet they had not. They had watched. They had summoned. They had built a case and issued an invitation. And at every step where the ordered, sensible, self-preserving thing would have been to end the anomaly before it could spread, the council had instead chosen to bring it closer, to look at it, to hear it speak. As though some part of the ancient mind of the conquered had wanted, against all its own instincts, to understand the thing before it destroyed it. Selvarin looked down at the young human standing in the well of cruel light, and for the first time in 300 years, she was not certain that she was the one conducting the trial. "You presume a great deal," said Councillor Toth, and his voter made the words wetter than usual, which was what happened when he was rattled. "The proceedings of this chamber are not yours to interpret." "No," Ada Reyes agreed, "but I've been watching this room since I walked in, and I notice things. It's a habit. Where I'm from we say a sharp eye sees what a loud voice misses." She picked her data slate back up, unhurried. "So let me tell you what I've noticed, and then you can decide whether to burn me. That seems fair." And Selvarin, who had silenced kings, found that she wanted very much to hear what the human had noticed. That want was, she would understand only much later, the first symptom. She had come to the chamber certain of what humanity was. She would not leave it certain of anything at all. The council did not, of course, permit the girl to simply continue. That was not how the chamber worked. A recess was called, the light dimmed, and the human was escorted to a holding gallery, while the 12 conferred in the private tongue that no translator was ever given, the language of the conquered's rulers, spoken only among themselves. "She is dangerous," said Vane the moment the doors sealed. His war fleets had burned 9 species to ash across the long history of the conquered, and he spoke of danger the way a physician speaks of infection, clinically, without heat. Not for her weapons. She has none. For her tongue. In one turn of the chamber she has spoken aloud a thing that unsettles the client observers who watch these proceedings. And there are 40 client species in the outer galleries who heard her ask why we did not simply burn her. They will remember that we did not answer. "Then we answer," said Toth. "We burn the human worlds and let the answer be smoke." "And prove her point," said Selvarin. The others turned to her. She had spoken little in the private tongue for many years. She had grown old, and her interventions had become rare, which lent them weight when she chose to spend it. Consider what she said, Selvarin went on. She said that a plague is burned quietly before it speaks, because speaking gives it time and reason gives it dignity. If we now burn her worlds in the sight of 40 client species, after summoning her here and letting her speak, we do not disprove her. We confirm the deeper thing she was pointing at. We confirm that we heard her, that we could not answer her, and that we resorted to fire because we had nothing else. Every client species in the outer dark will draw the same conclusion the Illith drew, that the conquered's order is not agreement. It is only fear, wearing agreement's clothes. A long silence. In the private tongue, silence had grammar. This one meant reluctant recognition. "Then what do you propose?" said Vane, "since you seem to have decided you are her advocate." "I am not her advocate." Selvarin felt the old iron come back into her voice and was grateful for it. "I am the conquered's, and the conquered has, for 11,000 years, ruled by a principle we have never once had to say aloud because it has never once been challenged. We do not rule by our fleets. Our fleets are the smallest part of us. We rule because the ordered peoples cannot imagine an alternative to us. We are not their master. We are their horizon. They do not obey the conquered the way a slave obeys a whip. They obey it the way a stone obeys the ground. It has never occurred to them that they might do otherwise, because we have made certain that the thought has no words, no shape, no example anywhere in the sky to point to and say, look, it can be done differently." She let the weight of it settle. The humans are the example. That is the entire danger, and it has nothing to do with their ships. They did not conquer the Illith. They did not arm them or incite them. They simply existed near them, visibly governing themselves by argument and consent and the changing of their own minds. And the Illith saw it and understood, for the first time in 4,000 years, that the horizon was not the edge of the world, that there was something past it. You cannot unshow a thing once it has been seen. You cannot burn an idea out of 40 galleries of witnesses by burning the one who spoke it, because the idea is not in her. It is in them now. It has already crossed. "Then it is already too late," said Toth, "and we should burn her out of spite." "No," Selvarin surprised herself with the force of it. "It is not too late because the idea is not yet finished. The humans have shown the client species that choice is possible. They have not yet shown them that choice is safe. Every people in the conquered that has ever imagined defiance has also imagined the fire that follows it, because we have taught them that lesson faithfully for 11,000 years. The Illith stopped their tribute, yes, but the Illith are afraid. Every client species that heard the humans speak today is afraid. They have a new word and they do not yet dare to use it, because they do not know whether the horizon has teeth. If we burn the humans now, we teach them the old lesson one final time, and it is the wrong lesson, because it makes the humans martyrs and it makes choice into a thing worth dying for. But if we do not burn them, if we let this girl speak and answer her and win, if we show the 40 galleries that a people stood on the disk and argued for the freedom to choose and lost the argument honestly on its merits, then choice becomes only another idea that was tried and found wanting. Then the horizon holds. It was, she thought, a masterful argument. It was the argument of 3 centuries of statecraft. It committed the council to nothing it could not undo. It preserved the appearance of magnanimity, and it turned the human girl's own boldness into the instrument of her defeat. Win the debate in the open, before the witnesses, and the contagion would burn itself out in the light. She saw the others turning it over, saw even Vane incline his heavy head, and she felt the satisfaction of a mind that has found the correct move. She did not yet understand that she had just agreed to have the argument, and that some arguments cannot be had without being changed by them. The recess ended. The light rose. Ada Reyes was returned to the disk, and she stepped onto it with the same unhurried curiosity as before, and the first thing she did was look up. "Delegate," said Selvarin, and now she spoke as the voice of the 12, and the chamber lent her words its terrible resonance. "You have asked why the conquered did not destroy your species. The conquered will answer, and the answer is this. We did not destroy you because we are not the thing your people imagine us to be. You imagine a tyrant. A tyrant fears rivals and strikes them down. But the conquered is not a tyrant. It is a gardener. It has tended the ordered peoples of this galaxy for 11,000 years, and under its tending they have known peace such as your violent little species has never dreamed of. No war among the client worlds in 4,000 years. No famine that was not answered. No plague that was not contained. We have given them order, and order is the only soil in which any living thing can grow. You call that tyranny because you are young, and you mistake the discipline of the garden for the cruelty of the cage. We let you live and speak, because a good gardener examines the weed before he pulls it, to be certain he has not mistaken it for a flower. It was a strong opening. She heard it land in the galleries, heard the low, resonant approval of the client observers, who were, after all, the tended garden and disposed to think well of their tending. Ada Reyes listened to all of it with her head slightly tilted, and when the chamber finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "That's a really good speech. I mean that. If I'd grown up here I think I'd believe it." "You do not believe it," said Selvarin. "I believe you believe it. That's different, and it's the part I want to talk about." The human took a step forward on the disc, into the brightest part of the light, and did not flinch from it. "You said the conquered is a gardener. I've been thinking about that because we have gardens too, and I know a few things about them. A gardener decides what grows. That's the whole job. The gardener looks at the ground and says, this here, not that. This flower in this row, that one pulled up, this branch cut back so the shape is right. And the garden is beautiful and it's peaceful and nothing in it is at war, and you're right, nothing in it starves." She spread her hands. "But nothing in it chose to be there either. The rose doesn't get to decide it would rather be an oak. The row doesn't get to decide it's tired of being a row. The garden's peace is real, counselor. I'm not going to stand here and pretend the client worlds aren't fed and safe, because they are, and that matters, and I won't insult them by saying it doesn't. But it's the peace of things that were arranged. And I think somewhere down inside, every single thing in a garden knows the difference between being cared for and being placed." "And your species offers what in place of the garden?" said Vane, his voice grinding down from the war seat. "We have seen your history, human. It is in our archives, every bloody page of it. You offer them the wilderness. You offer them your endless wars, your famines, your revolutions that devour their own makers. You would tear up the garden and call the weeds that grow back freedom. We have read what freedom costs your kind. We have read it in the number of your dead." The chamber stirred. It was a heavy blow, and it was true, and everyone knew it was true. Selvarin watched the human girl to see how she would carry the weight of her own history flung in her face before 40 galleries of witnesses, and she expected to see the young thing falter at last, because this was the wound that could not be argued away. Humanity's record was written in blood. Vane had not exaggerated a single page. Ada Reyes did not falter. Something moved across her young face, and it was not shame, though it held shame inside it. It was something more complicated, something Selvarin had no word for and would spend a long time afterward trying to name. "Yeah," the human said quietly. "We did all of that, every page you've got, and probably worse ones you didn't find. We killed each other over borders and gods, and the color of each other's skin, and things so stupid I'm ashamed to say them out loud in a room like this. Our freedom cost more lives than your garden has ever held. I'm not going to argue with the number because the number is right, and there are people back home who spend their whole lives grieving it." She looked up, and her voice did not rise, but it seemed to fill the sphere anyway. "But you're missing something, Counselor Vane, and it's the most important thing, and I think you're missing it because you've never had to learn it. We chose to stop. Nobody made us. No gardener came and pulled up the weed. We looked at what we'd done to each other, the whole bloody number of it, and we decided ourselves, with no one holding a fire over our heads, that we would try to be better. And we're not done. We fail at it all the time, but it's ours. The stopping is ours. Nobody gave us peace. We argued our way to it, one hard inch at a time, and every inch was chosen, and that's why it holds. Your garden has never had a single war. That's true. It's also never had a single peace. It's only ever had a gardener with a very good pair of shears. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. Selvarin felt it in her heart before she understood it in her mind. It was the silence of 40 galleries of tended, placed, well-fed peoples hearing, for the first time in 4,000 years, the difference between being safe and being sovereign spoken aloud by someone who was not afraid to say it. She looked out at the client observers, and she saw the stillness in them, the terrible attentive stillness, and she understood that her masterful plan had a flaw she had not foreseen. She had thought the danger was that the girl might win the argument. She saw now that the danger was that the argument was being had at all. Every moment it continued, in the open, before witnesses, taught the galleries that such things could be argued, that the horizon could be spoken to. That was the contagion, and she had invited it into the highest chamber of the conquered, and given it the chamber's own voice to speak with, and it was too late now to take the invitation back. The chamber called a second recess, and this time it was not the council that requested it but the galleries. That too had never happened. The 40 client species who observed the proceedings of the 12 did so under an old and rigid protocol. They were witnesses, not participants, permitted to watch so that they might carry home the lesson of what happened to those who troubled the order. They had no voice in the chamber. They had never asked for one. It had never occurred to them that asking was a thing they were permitted to do, which was, of course, the entire point of a garden. But when the human finished her words about the difference between being placed and being cared for, a single light kindled in the third gallery, the request to speak that the protocol technically allowed and that no client species had used in 1100 years, and the chamber, caught off its ancient rhythm, did not know how to refuse it. It was the Illith. Their delegate rose in the gallery, a slender figure sheathed in the pressurized water their bodies required, a translucent vessel through which pale limbs moved with the slow grace of deep currents. The Illith were the gentlest of the tended peoples. They had paid their grain levy for 4,000 years without a single complaint, and they had stopped without a single act of violence. And now their delegates spoke into the great chamber in a voice the translators rendered as soft and lapping, like water against a hull. "We did not stop our tribute to defy you," the Illith said. "We wish the council to understand this because we think the council does not, and because the human has been accused of turning us and she did not turn us. She never asked us to stop. She never asked us for anything. A human ship anchored in our shallows for a season, and its crew were curious about how we lived, and we were curious about how they lived, and we talked, the way neighbors talk, of small things and then of large ones. And one evening, a young human asked us a question that had no malice in it at all. She asked us what we would do with our grain if we did not send it to the conquered, and we did not understand the question. We told her that we send our grain to the conquered. That is what grain is for. And she said, yes, but if you didn't, what would you want to do with it? And we found that we had no answer, because in 4,000 years no one had ever asked us to want anything, and we had forgotten that wanting was a thing we were allowed to do. The Illith's limbs moved slowly in the water. That is all that happened. She did not tell us to stop. She asked us what we wanted, and the question would not leave. It stayed in the water with us all through the long night, and in the morning some of us were changed by it, and some of us were frightened by it, and we argued, which we had never done, and the arguing did not tear us apart as we had feared it would. It made us more ourselves than we had been in 4,000 years, and in the end we decided, not to defy the conquered, but simply to find out what we would do with our own grain once before we died so that we would know. That is the whole of our crime. We wish to know what we would choose. We are not asking the council to spare the human. We are asking the council to understand that if you burn her, you will not burn the question out of the water. It is in us now. It was always ours. She only asked it. The Illith delegate settled back into the gallery, and the water in its vessel went still, and the chamber was left holding the softest and most devastating testimony it had heard in 11,000 years, because it had come not from the accused but from the garden itself, from a flower rising in its row to say that it had, quietly and without malice, begun to wonder whether it was a flower. Selvarin sat with it. She looked out at the 40 galleries, and she saw that the Illith's words had done something that all the humans' eloquence could not have done alone. A client species had spoken. The protocol had allowed it technically for 1100 years, and no one had used it, because using it required first the thought that one might, and the garden had been designed to make that thought impossible. But the human had said her piece, and the Illith had heard it, and the thought had formed. And once the thought had formed, the old dead protocol had turned out to still be alive, waiting, the whole time, for someone to remember it was there. That, Selvarin understood, was how it would go now. Not with fleets, not with rebellion, with one small permission after another, each one always technically available, each one never before used, each one waiting in the architecture of the conquered for a mind free enough to notice that the door had been unlocked all along. "You see it," said a voice beside her, low in the private tongue. It was Vane. He had not moved from his war seat, but he had leaned toward her, and his ancient soldier's face was fixed on the still water of the Illith's vessel. "You see what she has done. She has not taught them to fight us. I could answer fighting. I have answered it 9 times. She has taught them to ask, and there is no fleet in creation that can burn a question out of a mind that has already thought it. I have spent 4,000 years preparing to defend the garden against the wilderness, Selvarin. I never once prepared to defend it against a question, because it never occurred to me that a question could be a weapon. It is the only weapon I have ever seen that grows stronger the more of it you destroy." "It is not a weapon," Selvarin said. "No," Vane agreed after a long moment. "That is the worst of it. If it were a weapon, I would know what it was. A weapon wants something. A weapon can be answered, negotiated, matched. But she wants nothing from us. She has asked for nothing. She came alone with no fleet, and she has offered us no terms because there are no terms. She is not here to take the garden from us. She is only here to show us, and the client worlds, that it was always only a garden, and that gardens are made, and that things which are made can be unmade or remade or simply, at last, asked. I could fight an enemy who wanted my power. How do I fight one who only wants everyone to notice that I have it?" Selvarin had no answer, and Vane did not seem to expect one. They sat together, the 2 oldest seats of the conquered, the war and the high, and watched the water go still in the 3rd gallery, and understood, each in their own way, that the age they had been born into had ended sometime in the last hour, quietly, without a shot, in the space between a human question and an Illith's slow reply. When the recess ended, the human was returned to the disk, and she looked, for the first time, uncertain. She had heard the Illith speak. The holding gallery carried the chamber's audio, and she had heard a species she had spent a single season with rise in front of the council and lay their fate beside her own. Selvarin watched the young human absorb it, watched something move across the unguarded face, and understood that the girl had not planned for that she had come expecting to argue and perhaps to die, and had not expected the garden to answer her, and that being answered had shaken her more than any threat the chamber had made. "You did not expect the Illith to speak," Selvarin said. "No," Ada Reyes admitted. "I didn't. I thought I was doing this alone. That was sort of the point. One person, no army, just to show you it doesn't take an army." She looked up at the galleries, at the 3rd one, at the still water there. "But they spoke. And now it's not just me, is it? Now if you burn my world, you have to look at them while you do it. And they knew that when they stood up. They knew exactly what it would cost them to be seen standing near me, and they did it anyway." Her voice caught very slightly, the first crack Selvarin had heard in it. "That's the thing I keep trying to tell you, and I don't have good enough words for. That's what free looks like. Not me, them. Somebody with everything to lose choosing to stand where it's dangerous because they decided for themselves that it was right. Nobody made them. I didn't make them. That's not a contagion, counselor. A contagion takes people over. This gave them back. That night, if the word night meant anything in a chamber that hung in the constant twilight of deep space, Selvarin did not rest. She went instead to the archive. The Concord's archive was the oldest structure in the Citadel, older than the chamber, older than the Twelve's own written history. It was a vault of light, a lattice of stored memory reaching back to the founding, and only the highest seats were permitted to walk its aisles alone. Selvarin walked them now, and she called up the record of humanity's first contact, and she watched it with old eyes that had grown in the space of a single day, uncertain of what they were seeing. The record was as Vane had said, blood and blood and blood. She watched the human species claw its way out of a single fragile world, watched it fracture and war and nearly end itself more than once. She watched famines it had caused and plagues it had spread and cruelties it had invented with a creativity that turned her stomach. She understood, watching, exactly why the Council had classified humanity as a destabilizing element. By every measure the Conquered used, humanity was chaos given hands. It should have been pruned at first contact. The gardener's shears should have closed. But she had come to the archive to answer a different question, and now she asked it of the light. Why had the shears not closed? The archive answered. It showed her the record of the First Contact Council, 11 decades past, when humanity was newly found and weak, and the vote to burn its worlds had been placed before the 12 of that age. She watched the vote. She had assumed it would be close, that some sentiment of mercy had spared the humans, some calculation of future use. It was not close. 11 of the 12 had voted to burn. One had not. The one who had not was named Oritka, and she had held the seat that Selvarin now held, 300 years and one predecessor ago. The archive preserved her words, spoken into that same chamber to 11 colleagues who had already decided. Selvarin stood in the Isle of Light and listened to the voice of the dead counselor who had once sat where she sat, and the voice said, "I do not vote to spare them because they are good. They are not good. I have read the same pages you have read, and they horrify me as they horrify you. I vote to spare them because of one thing in all their bloody record that I cannot stop looking at. In every other species we have ever tended when they do wrong, they do it because they were made to, or driven to, or because they knew no other way. Their cruelty is the cruelty of animals or of the desperate, and it can be managed, because a thing that harms only from need can be relieved of its need. But the humans are different, and it is the most dangerous difference I have ever seen. The humans, alone among all the peoples of the sky, do wrong while knowing it is wrong. They have a thing inside them that tells them, and they hear it, and sometimes they do the wrong thing anyway, and the record of it tortures them for 1,000 years afterward. And that same thing, that voice inside them that names the wrong, is the thing that lets them choose the right when nothing at all compels them to. You cannot have one without the other. The conscience that lets them fall is the conscience that lets them rise, and no gardener put it there, and no gardener can prune it out. I vote to spare them because I want to see what a creature does with a power like that. And I confess to this council that I am afraid of the answer, and that my fear is the truest reason I wish to know it. The vote had failed. Humanity had been spared by a single voice, and the reason recorded was not mercy and not use. It was that Oritka had been afraid, and had understood that her fear was pointing at something the Conquered did not have and could not make, and had wanted to know what it was. Selvarin stood in the light for a long time. She understood now why the shears had never closed, not in 11 decades, not at first contact, not when the humans grew stronger, not when the Illith stopped their tribute. At every juncture the sensible thing had been to burn, and at every juncture the council had instead watched and waited and summoned, and each generation of the 12 had told itself it was being strategic, being patient, being wise. But that was not it. The truth was the one Oritka had spoken and been unable to escape. The Conquered had not spared humanity because it was safe to do so. The Conquered had spared humanity because some deep-buried part of the oldest order in the galaxy wanted to know the answer to Oritka's question, and had been willing to risk everything to learn it. The Council's greatest fear had never been that the humans would grow strong enough to break the garden. The Council's greatest fear, the one it had never said aloud, the one that lived beneath every measured vote and every patient deferral, was that the humans were free in a way the conquered was not, and that if the conquered looked at that freedom long enough, it would no longer be able to unsee it in itself. She returned to her seat before the light dimmed. She told no one where she had been. The proceedings resumed. But something had shifted in the chamber, and everyone felt it, and the ones who felt it most were the ones who could not name it. Vane had spent the recess consulting his fleets, and he opened by reading into the record the plain military reality, the number of human worlds, the number of conquered vessels, the arithmetic by which the whole human question could be closed in a single season if the Council so willed. He read it not as a threat this time, but as a fact, laid down like a stone, because he was a soldier, and he believed that facts ended arguments. "You are telling me you can kill us," said Ada Reyes when he had finished. "You already told me that. I already believed you. I want to ask you something, Counselor Vane, and I want you to actually answer it, because I think you're the only one in this room honest enough to." She looked up at the war seat. "How many times have you used those fleets?" Vane was silent. "In 4,000 years of peace," the human said. "How many times has the conquered actually had to burn a world to keep the garden in order?" 9, said Vane. He did not have to consult a record. Selvarin understood that he carried the number the way she carried the memory of every king she had silenced, that it was written on some interior surface that never healed. 9 worlds, Ada Reyes said quietly, "in 4,000 years, and I'd bet everything I have that you remember every one of them. That you could tell me the names." She did not make it cruel. That was the strange thing. She said it almost gently, as if she and the old soldier were the only two people in the vast chamber who understood something the others did not. "You've got the biggest fleets in the galaxy, Counselor, and in 4,000 years you've had to use them 9 times, and every one of the 9 still costs you something to remember. That's not the record of a monster. I want to say that clearly in front of everyone. That's the record of somebody who hates the shears and uses them anyway because he thinks there's no other way to keep everyone safe." She paused. "I'm not here to tell you you're evil. I'm here to tell you there's another way, and that you've maybe suspected it for a long time, and that the reason my species scares this room isn't our ships. It's that we're standing here as proof of the thing you've been afraid to hope for." "And what," said Vane, and his voice had changed, gone low and rough in a way the chamber's resonance could not fully smooth, "is the thing I have been afraid to hope for?" "That you could put the shears down," Ada Reyes said, "and the garden wouldn't die. That the peace could hold without the fear underneath it. That the client worlds, if you let go of them, wouldn't fly apart into the wars you've spent 4,000 years preventing, but would choose the peace on their own and keep it because it was theirs." She looked slowly around the whole ring of seats and then out at the 40 galleries. "You think freedom means chaos because the only freedom you've ever read about is ours, and ours was born in blood. But you found us young, Counselor. You caught us in the middle of learning. If you'd found us 1,000 years from now, you'd have read a different record, and you'd have seen that the same conscience that made us kill is the thing that made us stop, and that a people who can choose to stop is not a plague. It's the only kind of people whose peace you can ever actually trust. Because it isn't held down, it's held up from the inside." Selvarin closed her eyes. Orikka's dead voice moved through her memory. The conscience that lets them fall is the conscience that lets them rise, and she understood that the human girl had just, without ever having heard those words, spoken their answer across a gulf of 300 years. The child on the disc had reasoned her way, alone, to the exact truth that had spared her species before she was born. And Selvarin saw, with a clarity that frightened her, that the girl was not trying to win the debate. She had stopped trying to win somewhere in the last hour. She was trying to give the council permission. She had looked at the oldest, most powerful order in the galaxy, and she had seen underneath its armor a thing that was tired, a thing that had carried the shears for 4,000 years and hated every one of the 9 cuts, and she had come not to defeat it, but to tell it that it was allowed to set the burden down. That, Selvarin thought, was the observation the girl had promised in the first hour. Not a weakness in the chamber's architecture, a weakness in its heart. She had walked into a room built to make her feel small, and she had seen, before anyone, that the room was afraid, and that its fear was not of her, but of its own oldest hope. "You presume," Selvarin said, and found her voice unsteady, "to know what this council hopes." Ada Reyes looked up at the high seat, and her young face was kind, and that kindness was somehow the most devastating thing that had happened in the chamber in 11,000 years. "No," she said, "I presume to notice. There's a difference, and I think you noticed it too, Counselor, a long time before I did. I think that's why you're the one who keeps letting me talk." Between the sessions, the council could not agree, and their disagreement was itself a kind of confession, because the 12 had not truly disagreed on anything in 4,000 years. Consensus was not a habit with them, it was an identity. To be the conquered was to be of one mind, and now they were of several, and each of them felt the fracture as a wound, and each of them understood without saying it that the wound had been made by a young human who had never once raised her voice. They convened in the private tongue, in the sealed room beneath the chamber, and for a long while no one spoke, because to speak first was to reveal which way one had turned, and none of them yet trusted the others enough to be first. It was Toth who broke it, and he broke it, as always, with the argument of the old order, but Selvarin heard something new underneath his words now, a strain, the sound of a mind arguing not to convince the others but to convince itself. "We are behaving," Toth said, "as though the choice before us is difficult. It is not difficult. It is only unpleasant, and we have confused the two because we are unaccustomed to unpleasantness. The human has made a beautiful argument and the Illith have made a moving one, and both arguments have the same flaw, which is that they mistake a feeling for a truth. It feels better to choose than to be placed. I grant it. It has always felt better. That is precisely why we forbid it, because the feeling of choosing is a drug, and like all drugs it demands more of itself, and the client worlds who taste it once will not be content with tasting it once. They will want to choose their governors, and then their laws, and then their borders, and then they will want to choose against one another, and then the wars begin, and the wars do not end, because there is no gardener left to end them. We are not debating whether choice feels good. We are debating whether we are prepared to trade 4,000 years of peace for a feeling. I say we are not. I say the peace is the truth, and the feeling is the drug. And I say it though I know it makes me the villain in the human story, because someone in this room must be willing to be hated in order to be correct. And if you are not correct, said Selvarin. Toth's voter was silent for a moment. Then I will have burned a world for nothing, he said, and I will carry it as Vane carries his 9, and I will deserve to. But I would rather carry one more world than gamble 4,000 years of granaries on the hope that 40 species, handed their freedom all at once, will use it as gently as an unarmed girl on a disc. She is one human, Selvarin. She is the best of them, sent here precisely because she is the best, to make us believe her kind are all like her. They are not. She showed us her own archive, the number of her dead. That is what freedom looks like when it is not standing on a disc making a speech. That is what it looks like in the dark, at scale, over centuries. I am not choosing against the girl. I am choosing against the number. It was the strongest form of the old argument, and Selvarin felt its pull because it was not wrong. The number was real. Freedom had a cost, and the human had admitted it, and the cost was written in blood in the archive. And a counselor who gambled the peace of 40 worlds on hope would answer for every death that followed forever. Toth was not a coward, and he was not cruel. He was afraid in the way that responsible people are afraid, afraid of what his own choice might unleash, and his fear was the mirror image of the human's courage. And Selvarin understood that the chamber's true division was not between good and evil, but between two different kinds of fear, and that this was the hardest kind of choice there was. "You are right about the number," Selvarin said slowly. "I will not pretend you are not. If we free the garden, some of the freed will do terrible things, and some of the blood will be on us for having opened the gate. I accept that. I want the chamber to hear me accept it, because I will not win this by pretending the danger is not real." She rose. "But consider the number you are not counting, Toth. You count the dead that freedom might make. You do not count the living that the garden has already unmade. 4,000 years without a war, yes. Also 4,000 years without a single people that chose its own shape. 40 species, and not one of them has authored a line of its own story in 4,000 years, because we authored it for them and called the silence peace. You count the blood freedom might spill. I am asking you to count the lives freedom would have lived, that the garden prevented from ever being lived at all, because a rose kept perfectly in its row for 4,000 years has not been saved from the wilderness. It has been saved from itself. You fear the deaths of the free. I have come to fear something worse. The unlived lives of the tended. There is no archive of those, Toth. That is the only reason your number looks larger than mine. Mine was never allowed to be written down." The room was silent, and in the silence Selvarin understood that she had crossed over completely, that the counselor who had entered the chamber 3 days ago certain of the garden was gone and would not return, and that she did not mourn her. "You have changed," Toth said, and it was almost an accusation and almost a grief. "Yes," Selvarin said. A sharp eye saw what a loud voice had been missing for 11,000 years, and once it was seen I could not unsee it. That is the whole of the contagion, Toth. It is not rebellion, it is only sight. She did not make me want to free the garden. She made me able to see that I had won and that I had made it and that I was responsible for it. Everything after that was mine. That is why we cannot burn her, not because she is dangerous. Because she is right, and we have known she was right since before she was born, and we have spent 11 decades pretending we did not, and I am too old to keep pretending. I would rather be responsible and afraid than safe and blind. I did not used to be able to say that. I can say it now. She gave me the words, or she gave me back the words I had buried. I no longer know which, and I have stopped believing the difference matters." Vane, who had said nothing, spoke at last from the shadowed end of the room. "I will stand with the high seat," he said. The oldest soldier of the conquered, the keeper of the 9 burned worlds, laid his weight onto Selvarin's side of the scale, and the room shifted around it like a ship taking a wave. "Not because I am persuaded that freedom is safe. It is not. I have seen what the human's kind did to itself, and I do not doubt for one moment that the freed garden will bleed. But I have carried the shears for 4,000 years, and I have listened to Toth's number my whole life, and I have used the number to justify every cut, and today, in that chamber, an unarmed child asked me how many times I had used my fleets, and I told her 9, and she said she would bet I remembered every name. And I do, Toth. I remember every name. And I understood when she said it that I have spent 4,000 years being the thing that remembers the names so that the rest of you would not have to, and that I am tired, and that I have wanted for longer than I can say, for someone to tell me I was allowed to want a different way. She did not tell me. That is the strange part. She only asked her question and let me hear my own answer, and in my own answer was the tiredness I had never let myself hear. I will put the shears down. I have earned the right to be tired, and I would rather spend the years I have left defending a garden that chose me than commanding one that only fears me. 9 names is enough. I will not add the human's world to make it 10. Toth looked from Vane to Selvarin, and the fight went slowly out of him, not into agreement but into the deeper thing beneath agreement, the recognition that the age had turned and that he had lost, and that perhaps a part of him, the same buried conscientious part that lived in all of them, was not entirely sorry to have lost. "Then it is decided," Toth said, and I will vote against it, and I will be recorded voting against it because someone must be, so that the client worlds know the choice was real and was contested and was not handed down from a united throne. Let them see that we disagreed. Let them see that even we were free." He almost laughed, a dry, broken sound in the private tongue. "You have made even our division into a gift for them. She has, I mean. Everything she touches becomes another proof that choosing is possible, even our refusal to choose as she wished. There is no defeating her. Every move on the board, including resistance, teaches the lesson she came to teach. I have never in 11,000 years faced an argument I could lose in every direction at once. Take your vote, Selvarin. Free the garden. I will be your loyal opposition, which is a thing this conquered has never had, and which is, I suppose, her doing as well." The accusation, gentle as it was, could not go unanswered, because the whole architecture of the chamber depended on the fiction that the 12 were a single will. If a client species in the outer galleries came to believe that the council was divided, that one of its highest seats had been quietly siding with a petitioner, then the horizon cracked, and behind the crack was the thing the conquered could never afford to show. Toth understood this. He rose from his seat, which the ritual permitted only in moments of gravest consequence, and the whole ring stirred at the breach of custom. "This proceeding has become a theater," Toth said, and his voter had lost its wetness now, gone hard and cold. "The human weaves a pretty argument and we sit and let her weave it, and with every turn of the chamber she draws us further from the only question that matters. She stands accused of destabilizing the ordered peoples of the conquered. That charge is not a matter of philosophy. It is a matter of fact, and the fact is proven. The Illith have stopped their tribute. 2 client species have petitioned to elect their own governors. This is destabilization, whatever poetry the human wraps it in, and the remedy for destabilization has been the same for 11,000 years. I move that the debate be closed and the sentence entered. I move that the human worlds be pruned from the garden, as 9 worlds were pruned before them, so that the order which has fed and sheltered 40 species for 4,000 years may continue to feed and shelter them. I move for the fire, and I ask the chamber to remember, before it is seduced by a child, what the alternative to the garden has always been." He turned slowly to face the galleries, and he raised his voice to fill them. "The alternative is the wilderness. It is her history. It is the number of her dead. She stands here and asks you to trade the safety of 4,000 years for the freedom that killed more of her own kind than your whole garden has ever held. Ask yourselves, tended peoples, whether you would make that trade. Ask yourselves whether you would give up the certainty of the harvest for the privilege of starving by your own choice. That is what she offers you. Choice. And choice is only another word for the freedom to suffer consequences that a wiser hand would have spared you. I have governed with you for 4,000 years. I have never once let you starve. She would have you thank her for the right to." It was, Selvarin had to admit, the correct argument. It was the argument the whole conquered was built on, spoken plainly and without shame, and she watched it move through the galleries and she saw it land, saw the tended peoples remember their harvests and their 4,000 years of full granaries, saw the fear of the wilderness stir in them the way it had always stirred, the ancient, useful fear that had kept the garden still. Toth had found the seam and driven the wedge, and for a moment Selvarin believed he had won, that the contagion would burn out here in the light exactly as her own plan had intended, and that she should be glad of it. She looked at the human girl to see her defeated. Ada Reyes was not defeated. She was listening to Toth with her whole body, leaning slightly forward, and when he finished, she did something no petitioner had ever done in the history of the chamber. She turned her back on the 12. She turned to face the galleries herself, the 40 species of the tended garden, and she spoke to them directly, not to her judges but to the judged, and the chamber's resonance, which had been built to carry only the voices of the 12, faltered and then, for reasons no engineer could later explain, carried hers. "He's right," she said, and the simple concession stunned the room. About the fear, Counselor Toth is right that the wilderness is real, and that choice comes with consequences, and that a hand that spares you those consequences is offering you something real. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that freedom is safe, because it isn't, and you know I was lying because you can see my history in the archives same as they can. Freedom cost us more than I can say. He's right about the number. She took a breath. But I want to ask you something, all of you, and you don't have to answer out loud. You just have to answer it inside, where nobody can prune it. When Counselor Toth says he has never once let you starve, and it's true, he never has. When he says he keeps you safe, and it's true, he does, ask yourselves this one thing. Did you ever get to say thank you? Not because you were afraid not to, not because the granary depends on it. Did you ever once get to choose to be grateful freely, the way you choose to thank a friend? Or has it always just been arranged, like everything else in the garden, so that even your gratitude was placed there for you, in its row, where it was supposed to grow? The chamber had never been so silent. Selvarin realized she was holding her breath, and that around the ring the other counselors were as still as she was, and that out in the 40 galleries not one tended creature moved. I think a person can love their garden, Ada Reyes said, more quietly now, so that the whole vast sphere had to strain toward her. I think you can be grateful for safety and for full granaries and for 4,000 years without a single war. I don't think any of that is a lie, and I won't let anyone tell you it is, not even to win. But love that you weren't allowed to withhold isn't love. It's just whether it happens to you. And I think somewhere down inside every one of you knows the difference, the same way the rose would know if it could think that it never chose the row. That's all we did to the Illith. We didn't arm them, we didn't turn them. We just talked to them long enough that they realized they'd never once been asked. And the moment a person realizes they were never asked, they can't unrealize it. Not because it's a weapon, because it's true. And you can burn the ones who said it out loud, you can burn my whole species tomorrow, but you'll be doing it in front of everyone who just heard the question, and the question doesn't burn. It's already inside you now. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry. I don't know which. But it's done. She turned back around to face the 12. That's my whole argument, she said, and she sounded, for the first time, tired and young and human. I don't have ships to back it up. I came here alone on purpose because I wanted this room to see that the thing you're afraid of doesn't need an army. It just needs to be said once in a place where people can hear it. So say your sentence. Burn us or don't. But everyone in this room already knows that it won't matter to the thing you actually fear, because that thing already happened. The moment you decided to let me speak instead of burning us quietly in the dark. You had one chance to keep the question from ever being asked, and you didn't take it, and I think the reason you didn't take it is the most human thing I've ever seen a non-human do. You wanted to know the answer more than you wanted to stay safe. That's conscience, counselor. That's the whole thing. You've had it all along. And Selvarin, in the highest seat, felt the last of her certainty go out of her like breath, because the girl had just described Orikka's vote without ever knowing it existed, had reached across 300 years and named the buried thing in the heart of the conquered, the wanting to know that had spared humanity against all sense, and had shown it to the council as a mirror, and the council could not look away. Toth was still standing. The motion for the fire is before the chamber, he said, but his voter wavered and everyone heard it waver. I call the vote. You cannot call the vote, said Selvarin. Only the high seat calls the vote, and I am not ready to call it. Then you are compromised, Toth said, wheeling on her, as she said you were, and this chamber has a right to know why the high seat protects a human who has just told 40 client species that their gratitude is a lie. She did not say it was a lie, Selvarin said. She rose now from the high seat, the second breach of custom in an hour, and the chamber's resonance gathered around her out of ancient habit, giving her the full weight of the conquered's voice, and she found that she did not want it. She found that she wanted, for the first time in 300 years, to speak as only herself. She said it was placed, And she is right, Toth. I have sat in this seat for 300 years, and I have called 40 species grateful, and I never once asked whether they had been permitted to be anything else. I did not ask because the question had no words. She brought the words. That is the whole of her crime. And I will not vote to burn a world for bringing words into a room that had been kept empty of them on purpose. The chamber erupted, in its slow, ancient way, the resonance tangling as counselors spoke over one another for the first time in living memory, and out in the galleries the 40 tended peoples watched the horizon crack open in front of them and saw, at last, what had always been behind it. Not a gardener. 12 tired, frightened, ancient minds, arguing, uncertain, divided, choosing in front of everyone and not knowing what they would choose. Selvarin looked down at the human girl standing alone in the well of light, and Ada Reyes looked back up at her, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left to say. The observation had been made, the question had been asked, and the oldest order in the galaxy stood exposed as the one thing it had spent 11,000 years insisting it was not, a thing that could choose, a thing that therefore could be judged, a thing with a conscience, which meant a thing that could fall, which meant, if Oritka had been right, a thing that could also, finally, rise. The vote, when it finally came, took 3 days, and the histories would argue for 1,000 years afterward about what it had truly been a vote on. Officially, it was a vote on the motion for the fire. Officially, the motion failed, 7 seats to 5, and the human worlds were spared. But everyone who had stood in the chamber understood that the fire had never really been the question. The question had been the one Ada Reyes asked in her first hour on the disk, the one that the council had never been able to answer without unmaking itself. If you truly believe you are a gardener and not a jailer, why do you need the shears at all? Selvarin did not sleep in those 3 days. She walked the aisles of the archive again and again, and she read the record of the 9 burned worlds, and for the first time in 300 years, she read them not as necessary prunings but as choices, made by counselors who could have chosen otherwise, and she wept, which she had believed her kind incapable of, and discovered that they were not. She understood now what Oritka had understood alone, 300 years ago, and had been unable to make the council see. That the moment you admit a thing is a choice, you become responsible for it. That the conquered had spent 11,000 years insisting it was a horizon, a ground, a law of nature, precisely so that it would never have to be responsible for what it did. A gardener is not guilty of the flowers he does not plant, but a person who holds the shears and knows they are shears and closes them anyway is guilty, and can never again pretend otherwise. Humanity's true contagion was not rebellion. It was responsibility. The humans had walked into the garden and, simply by choosing freely in front of everyone, had reminded the gardener that he, too, had always been choosing, and had therefore always been accountable, and had spent an age of the galaxy pretending he was not. You cannot unlearn that you are free. That was the thing. That was the thing the whole 11,000 years had been built to prevent, and a single unarmed young human had undone it in 3 days, not with a fleet, not with a weapon, but by being visibly, unmistakably, contagiously free, and by trusting that freedom to spread the way the truth spreads, which is to say quietly and inward and without any force at all. On the 3rd day, Selvarin called the chamber to order for the last time under the old rules, and she did something that had no precedent in 11,000 years. She stepped down from the high seat, and she walked to the edge of the disk, and she descended to it, so that she stood beside the human girl in the well of light, an ancient counselor and a young human of a violent little species, side by side in the place built to make petitioners feel small. And she found, standing there, that the light was not so terrible from within. It had only ever been terrible to those who believed they had to face it alone. I am going to tell the galleries the truth, Selvarin said to Ada Reyes quietly before she raised her voice. All of it, what we are, what we have done, that we are not a horizon but a choice and that we have always been. I do not know what happens after that. The garden may fly apart. The wars we spent 4,000 years preventing may come. You warned me freedom is not safe, and I believe you, and I am about to hand it to 40 peoples who have never held it, and some of them will use it terribly, the way your people did, and the blood may be on my hands." She looked at the young human. "Why are you not afraid?" "I am," Ada Reyes said. "I'm terrified. I've been terrified since I walked in. But I noticed something a long time ago back home watching people. The ones who are safe and placed and never allowed to choose, they're not really at peace. They're just quiet. And the quiet always breaks eventually, and when it breaks after 4,000 years, it breaks worse than any war. You're not choosing between safety and danger, counselor. That was never the choice. You're choosing between a peace that's held down and a peace that's held up, and only one of them lasts, and the only way to get the one that lasts is to risk the one that doesn't." She almost smiled. "That's not human wisdom. That's just true. We only found it first because we fell first." Selvarin raised her voice, and the chamber gave her its resonance one final time, and she spoke to the 40 galleries of the tended garden the words that ended the conquered as it had been and began whatever came after. She did not soften them. She told them that the council had never been a law of nature, that it had been 12 minds choosing all along. That the safety they had known was real and the gratitude they felt was real, but that neither had ever been asked for, and that from this day the asking would begin. That the tribute was ended, not suspended, ended, and that any world that wished to leave the garden might leave it, and any world that wished to remain might remain, and that the difference from this day forward would be that they had chosen, and that the conquered would have to earn, every year, the loyalty it had spent 11,000 years compelling. "You will call this our fall," Selvarin said, "and perhaps it is. But a human taught me in this room that the same thing which lets a people fall is the thing that lets them rise, and that you cannot have the one without the other, and that a people too safe to fall is also a people too tended to rise. We have kept you from falling for 4,000 years. We told ourselves it was mercy. It was fear. We were afraid of what you might choose, because if you could choose, then so could we, and then we would be responsible for everything, every harvest and every fire and every one of the 9 worlds we burned to keep you still. We did not want to be responsible, so we made ourselves into a horizon, and we made you into a garden, and we called the arrangement peace. It was not peace. It was only the quiet before a question. The question has now been asked. There is no unasking it. So we will do the frightening thing instead, and give you the answer for yourselves to make." She never named the human. The histories ever after would record only that a young delegate of the human species had come before the Council of 12, and without a single weapon, without a fleet, without a threat that anyone could point to, had ended the oldest order in the galaxy by the simple act of noticing what it was afraid of and saying it out loud. Some records called her the questioner. Most did not name her at all, because she had asked in her last hour in the chamber that her name be left out of it. When Selvarin asked her why, the young human had shrugged, that human gesture that meant nothing and everything. "Because if it's got my name on it, it's mine," she said. "And if it's mine, it can be taken away or argued with or made into a hero, and then people follow the hero instead of thinking for themselves, and that's just the garden again with a different gardener. I don't want them to remember me. I want them to remember the question. The question doesn't belong to anyone. That's the whole point. That's the only reason it works." She picked up her data slate, which she had never once opened, and Selvarin understood at last that there had never been anything on it, that the girl had carried it only so the chamber would think she needed notes, only so that she could set it down, unopened, and let the room see that she had never needed them. "A sharp eye sees what a loud voice misses, counselor. I saw that this room was afraid. That's all I brought. Everything else was already here. It was always already here." She went home. The human worlds neither conquered nor were conquered. They simply continued, arguing and failing and choosing and grieving their choices and making them anyway, as they always had. And the garden, freed, did not fly apart into the wars the council had feared, though it came close, more than once in the hard first century of the asking. Some worlds left. Most offered the choice, chose to stay, and their staying was the first thing in 4,000 years that the conquered had not arranged, and it held because it was held up and not held down, exactly as the human had said. Vane put down the shears. He said, in the end, that he had been waiting 4,000 years for someone to give him permission to, and had never understood that the permission could only ever come from himself, and that the human had not given it to him, but had only stood where he could see her giving it to herself, and that this had turned out to be the same thing. Selvarin served the new conquered until she died, and in her last hour she asked for the record of Orikka's vote to be read to her, the dead counselor's dead voice speaking across the centuries about a creature that did wrong while knowing it was wrong, and could therefore choose the right when nothing compelled it. And she listened to it with her old eyes closed, and understood that the whole 11,000 years had been a single long refusal to hear that voice, and that a young human had walked into the chamber and made them hear it in 3 days. The council's greatest fear had never been human power. It had faced power before and broken it, and the fleets of the conquered had never once had cause to fear a human ship. Its greatest fear had never been human weapons or human numbers or the long bloody record in the archive. Its greatest fear was the thing that had no fleet and needed none. It was that humans chose freely, with a conscience that let them fall and let them rise, and that freedom, once it is seen, cannot be unseen, and once it is spoken, cannot be unasked, and spreads not by conquest but by example quietly, inward from one mind to the next, until the whole galaxy is awake and choosing and responsible and afraid and free. The Council had feared it for 11,000 years and had spared humanity anyway, because underneath the fear was the same thing that made the fear, the wanting to know, the buried conscience of the ancient order, waiting all that time for a young human with a sharp eye to walk into the room, and gently, without a single weapon, without even raising her voice, set it free.